Hello friends, my name is Lalit Soni and I welcome you all in this special episode which is related to Budget 2024. Now budget is around the corner and you all know that budget is quite important for your prelims and mains examination. So ultimately when we are talking about civil services exams, budget and economic survey forms very important aspects of it. So in this episode, we will be talking about those aspects which are related to your economy part with respect to budget. We will be talking about all those aspects here, and then all those aspects which are related to your legal or let's say constitutional part that will be discussed in the polity primer episode. Okay. So in this episode, let's start with the budget 2024 and we will be talking about few aspects. So in this episode, we'll be talking about why this session is special and why this is important and why we have taken this particular episode. Then we'll be talking about understanding government budgeting. What is government budgeting? Who does that? Okay. After that, we'll talk about the objective. What are the objectives of budgeting? Then we'll move forward to the formulation process. The process which government or different departments and ministries of government take part in budget formulations. We'll be talking about that, and then we'll talk about components of the government budget. So government budget has different parts. We'll be talking about that, and then some important terminologies which are important for your, let's say, budget. Other than that, also when we are talking about the overall economy portion, that the terminologies will be important for you. Okay, there are chances that they might be asked directly in the examination. And then practice question for your prelims. Okay, so let's move forward. We will start with why this episode, why we have taken this episode. So we know that government will be announcing budget very soon, that is 1st of February. This time government is going to go for interim budget every time when there is election. So for the expenditure before the months of elections, so there are governments don't go for overall budget, or you can say wholesome budget. They go for interim budget, or sometimes you use this term as in vote on account. Okay, so we'll be talking about what is interim budget, what is vote on account. But right now in this episode we'll be starting with the union budget and then we'll move forward with the different aspects of it. Okay, so ultimately since budget is around the corner, that is why we have taken this particular episode. To make well-informed decision and to properly comprehend the budget, one must have a thorough understanding of the basic concepts. So basically, as I told you, for your preparation, having an you can say holistic approach, or you can say holistic understanding of budget is important, and that is why we have come up with this particular episode. So let's understand government budgeting. So when we are talking about budgeting is nothing but a process wherein government take you can say all the calculations or the estimations, and they ultimately try to find out what they have spent, what they have gained, and what would be the way forward. Okay, so ultimately you can say that government budgeting refers to the process through which government plans and manages its financial resources for a specific period. So when we are talking about specific period, generally budget is gone for you know that we have this estimates, and then we have this last year's data. Okay, so ultimately all these things are done for one financial year. Okay, so that specific time period is basically your financial year. In the context of country like India, the government budget plays a crucial role in shaping country's economic policies, addressing socio-economic challenges, and ensuring efficient allocation of resources. So since we know that we have this issues related to poverty, etc., so it is quite important and imperative for us to go for, you can say, equitable allocation of resources, and in that regard budget becomes very important. Okay, so when we are talking about budgets, there are two aspects of it, that is one related to your economic part and second is political and constitutional part. So in this video we'll be talking about the economic aspect, and the political and the constitutional aspect of it will be covered in the polity primer. Okay, so stay tuned with us, and if you have not subscribed the channel, please subscribe the channel. Okay, objective of the government budgeting. So there are various objects which has been taken you can say taken under consideration when you are going for the budgeting. Here you can say resource allocation. As I told you, we have this economy wherein there are different sections. Okay, there are you can say rich class, upper middle class, lower middle class, poor section. Okay, so for all these things, when we are talking about government is going for various welfare schemes, etc. For that, and the ministries which has to perform their own function, for that resources are to be allocated. So one objective is to resource, do efficient resource allocation. Second is economic stability. So whenever economy is going through some kind of slumps, or you can say slowdown, government has to go for spending. Okay, so you can say that is public spending or public expenditure. So that is done by government, and for that also budgeting is quite important. How much you have to spend on what, that is quite important. Okay, third is income redistribution. As I told you, you can say income redistribution, or you can say resource or financial resources redistribution. Mostly in that regard, we hear taxes are important. Okay, so basically if there is a person who is earning more, we have progressive system of taxation, and then if he is earning more, he will be paying more taxes. Okay, so that taxes will be going to government, and then now government will spend all these things on other strata of people, or you can say other sections of people. So here you can say there is a income redistribution, because when taxes are there and government is going to spend all these things on employment generation, ultimately this employment generated will create income for the other sections of the society, let's say middle class, lower middle class, all these things. So that is why here you can say that incomes are ultimately redistributed. Okay, then comes public goods and services. So since government has this job for providing governance and various services, and in that regard there is a lot of money required. Okay, and for the implementation of various services, government required money, and that is also included in the government budgeting. Okay, which services would require how much of money, they are going for various estimations, and then that money is allocated for them. Okay, then debt management. In the process of budgeting, in the process of running a government, running an economy, government also go for borrowing. Okay, so that debt is also managed. That is basically your, you can say, fiscal deficit, fiscal policy, all these things are basically your debt management tools. Okay, then inflation control. So when we are talking about inflation, generally we talk about monetary policy. Okay, that is related to your RBI, but these spendings which government does ultimately have effect on you can say inflation. Okay, so when we are talking about incomes of farmers, etc., or let's say MSP, etc., all these aspects are somehow influencing the inflation also. Okay, so that is why we can say that in process of countering inflation, and in process of formulation of budget, they actually consider all these aspects as well. Okay, increasing growth. Ultimate objective of management of the financial resources is economic growth. So that is one thing. Okay, along with growth, here we can say that also development. Okay, then environmental management, then stimulating investments, and social and political priorities. Okay, so ultimately we are trying to get these investment, we are trying to go for social and political priorities, which welfare scheme is to be implemented when, which scheme is to get more funds, which is to get lesser funds, how these funding would be managed. All these are basically considered in budgeting, and these are basically broad objective of budgeting. Okay, now we can move forward. Here we can see that there are certain, you can say, formulation process of government budgeting. So basically when we are talking about formulation of budget, or when we are talking about the process, the holistic process through which budgeting is done, there are various levels, various steps through which this particular thing happen. So here you can say there is a pre-budget consultation. All the stakeholders, let's say be it from the ministries, be it from the departments, various departments of the ministries, and let's say industrial player, all these players are stakeholders in budgeting, and we have this pre-budget consultations with them. Okay, then receipt of expenditure estimates. Various ministries actually submit their estimations, the kind of money they would require for the implementation of the various policies, or you can say working of government related to their ministry or their department. So they will submit the expenditure estimates. Okay, then estimate of revenue. The revenue estimate is submitted by the finance ministry. Finance ministry will go through all the kind of taxes, and they will kind of give you an estimate that this much amount they are expecting to receive at this particular point of time. Then macroeconomic framework. In the process of formulation of budget, they will also consider all the macroeconomic frameworks, like let's say when we are talking about GDP, when we are talking about inflation, poverty, unemployment, all these elements they will consider, okay, in this particular step. Then fiscal policy review. We have seen that in the previous slide, that there is debt management, okay. For that debt management, this fiscal policy review is quite important. What should be the fiscal deficit, what should be the kind of borrowing which government should go for, all these aspects are covered here. Then budgetary framework. So when we are talking about budgetary frameworks, that is nothing but you can say some part of allocations, some priority, how to decide the priorities, and then ultimately we go for the allocation of the resources, okay. This allocation can be sectoral, okay. And then there is this capital and revenue budget. These are component of budget. We will be discussing all those things. But after that, there is in the process, there is presentation of the budget. So this presentation, or you can say tabling of the budget in the parliament, okay, and then budget discussion and approval. So all these are, you can say, legal aspects, legal, political, or you can say constitutional aspects. All these things will be covered in your polity primer. Okay. Now moving further, here you can see various components of budgets are there. So when we are talking about government budget, there are budget receipts and budget expenditure. Receipt is something, you can say, incoming, whatever government is getting into their fund, that is income, or you can say the receipt which is government, which or you can say money government is receiving, okay. So there can be revenue receipt and the capital receipt. In simple words, you can say the revenue receipts are those which are getting on, you can say for shorter period of time, or you can say for day to day thinking. And then when we are talking about capital, that is, you can consider them as the long term, okay. Then there is this expenditure. The expenditure is something outgoing funds, okay, whatever government is spending. So there are revenue expenditures and capital expenditures. Revenue expenditures are the short term day-to-day expenditures, and the capital expenditures are for, you can say, capital creation or infrastructure creation, whatever money is spent, okay. So let's talk about them in detail here. When we are talking about revenue receipts, or when we are talking about receipt, whatever is coming to the government, so there are revenue receipts and there are capital receipts. Oh, okay. So when we are talking about revenue receipts, we have tax revenue receipts and we have non-tax, okay. Government has various source of income. One of them is tax revenue, okay. From taxes, government collects from the people on income, or let's say there are other goods and services tax, etc. So such things or such incomes are basically your tax revenue, okay. So here you can say there are direct taxes, there are indirect taxes, or income taxes, corporate wealth tax, gift tax, estate tax. All these things are basically your direct tax, the burden of which is on the individual. And then here we have indirect tax, that is sales tax, custom tax, excise duty, service tax, entertainment tax. All these things are basically your indirect taxes, okay. So through these taxes, government get their, you can say, tax revenue, okay. Tax revenue are basically part of your revenue receipts, because they are, government is getting these revenues, you can say, on yearly basis, okay. And then when we are coming to non-tax revenues, these basically are nothing but outside tax, whatever government is getting, okay. So let's say if government is imposing some kind of fees, okay, all these aspects are covered in non-tax revenues. Here you can say interest receipts, profit and dividends. From the PSUs government has, we receive profit and dividends. So that is one thing. Then we have fees and fines, then external grants, special assessment, etc. All these things are part of your non-tax revenue, okay. So ultimately we can say that anything which is outside tax and government is receiving, they are basically your non-tax revenue, okay. Then when we are talking about capital receipts, capital receipt components are, you can say, something related to long term. So let's say government has given a loan, okay. and after some 5 to 10 years the maturity happens, and then government receives the principal amounts back. Okay, so that is your capital receipt, because after it is not on yearly basis, it is on the maturity of that particular agreement. Okay, so here you can say recovery of loans. Okay, this investment, whenever government is going to go for this investment of your PSUs etc., from that whatever money comes, that is basically your capital receipt. Okay, that is also not yearly basis, because the thing is these investments are decided by the government how much this investment government has to go for. Okay, so that can vary on year to year basis. Okay, and then when we're talking about borrowings are also part of your capital receipts, because borrowings are also long term. Okay, so all these aspects like recovery of loans, disinvestment, borrowings and provident funds are basically part of your capital receipts. Now moving forward, component, when we are talking about budget expenditures. Okay, we have talked about the receipt part, and now we are coming to the expenditure part. So in expenditure also we have that revenue expenditure, and then we have capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure, you can say that government's day-to-day expenditure. So again, this is short term. Okay, so here you can say payment of interest. So whenever government is going for a loan, payment of interest is periodic basis. Okay, so that is payment of interest. Then payment of salary and pensions, that government has to give to their employees at a monthly basis, so that is also there. Then grants and subsidies, education and health services, defense services, all these things are component of your revenue expenditures. Okay, these are basically your day-to-day expenditure of government. And then when we come to the capital expenditure are basically something which reduce the liability or create assets. Okay, here you can say that if you are going for any kind of infrastructure project, okay, you are spending money, so this is a long term asset creation. Okay, so ultimately this is capital expenditure. Here you can say construction of road, bridge, buildings, these are infra. And then purchase of land and machinery, investment in shares, loans to states and foreign government, and repayment of loans. All these aspects are basically your capital expenditures. Okay, now moving further, here you can say, so there are some specific terminology which is quite popular in the economy. Whenever we talk about budget, there is these things, budgetary deficits. Okay, so when we are talking about budgetary deficit, so we go for overall expenditure minus the overall receipts. So whatever money is going out minus whatever is coming in, that is basically your budgetary deficit. Okay, then we talk about revenue deficit. So when we say revenue deficit, so we use this revenue expenditure out of which we take away the revenue receipts. Okay, so that is quite simple. From revenue expenditure we take away the revenue receipts. Okay, now when we are talking about here, one more is that capital deficit. Okay, so here we use the capital expenditure out of which we take away the capital in receipts. Okay, so capital expenditure minus capital receipts. Okay, so that is basically your capital deficit. Then comes fiscal deficit. This fiscal deficit is quite important, because this is basically gives an idea about the, you can say, government's borrowing. Okay, so basically here you can say that total expenditure minus total receipt, excluding whatever money government got from the borrowing. Okay, so basically if whatever expenditure you are going for, out of which we will take away the whatever receipts, whatever we are getting in. Okay, whatever money government is getting, out of which we will take away the borrowings. So ultimately we can say that fiscal deficit basically represents the borrowings of the government. Okay, then there is this primary deficit. From this fiscal deficit, if we take away the interest, okay, so from the fiscal deficit, if we take away the interest payment, that gives you the primary deficit. Okay, now there is this term, that is debt financing. So when we are talking about debt financing, that basically means from the fiscal deficit we take away the borrowing from the other sources. There are various sources of the government. Okay, so when we take away these borrowings from the other sources, we get the debt financing. It refers to the borrowing undertaken by the government to cover its budget deficit. Okay, so basically these are some important terminologies which we have discussed now. And now coming to the interim budget and vote on account. Mostly we use these terms interchangeably, but there is a minute difference. We'll talk about that. Why we are talking about these two terms here is because recently, as I told you, government said that they will be going for presentation of the budget on 1st of February, and that budget would be interim budget. Here you can say budget session of parliament scheduled from January 31st to February 9, interim budget presentation on February 1st. Okay, so this interim budget is because of the election year. Okay, the upcoming Lok Sabha elections may influence the timing of the full budget presentation expected in July after a new government is elected. So once the new government comes, that government will have the mandate and government will decide the budget of that particular year. Okay, but the thing is, before the budget is coming, you have to run the expenditure, and that is why interim budget is actually voted upon. Okay, so interim budget and vote on account are mostly when we are going for the short term budgeting and not for the whole year. Okay, here you can say when we are talking about interim budget, we include receipt and expenditure. We talk about receipt and expenditure. Then if there is a change in direct tax, so that is also included in the interim budget, and discussion is required. Whenever there is an interim budget, parliamentary discussion will be there. Okay, so that is one aspect. When we are talking about vote on account, in vote on account, you don't have to go for any kind of parliamentary discussions. There will only be a voting. Okay, and only expenditure. Here we have talked about receipt and expenditures, but here we will be talking about only expenditures. Okay, then we have direct tax. When we are talking about direct taxes, in this particular event of vote on account, these direct taxes will be unaltered. There won't be any change in direct taxes. Okay, so here, as I told you, in interim budget, you can change the tax rates, etc., tax slabs, etc. Okay, so there can be a change in direct tax. Okay, but when we are talking about vote on account, there cannot be any change in the direct tax. Okay, when we are talking about interim budget, there will be a voting and discussion. And when we are talking about vote on account, there will only be a vote and no discussion in the parliament. Okay, and when we are talking about the interim budget, we talk about revenue, both receipt as well as expenditure. Okay, and when we are talking about vote on account, we only talk about the expenditure. Okay, so here this difference is, I think this difference is clear. A vote on account contains only expenditure of the government, whereas interim budget deals with both receipt and expenditure. So basically, when government is saying that they are going for the interim budget, they will be talking about their receipt as well as expenditure. There will be a discussion in the parliament, and there might be a change in the direct tax. Okay, so I think that is all about budget, whatever economic aspect of the budgets are. With that, we'll move forward to the question for your practice. That is, if a government has a fiscal deficit, it implies there are 4 options given. A, the government is running a surplus. B, borrowings are not required. C, there is a need for borrowing. D, the government is borrowing from other countries. Okay, so you have to attempt this question and answer in the comment box. With that, I would like to wrap up the session. So if you have not subscribed the channel, please subscribe the channel. So thank you. I'll see you next time. Have a good day.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.